Hey everyone, welcome back to our lectures and our course in religion in America. And today we're going to begin a lecture discussing the early new religious movements in America that kind of coalesce or get their impetus from the Second Great Awakening. So we need to discuss what was the Second Great Awakening, what was some of its root causes, and then we'll get into some of the various movements within the early new religious movements within America. And then finally, in our at the end of our lecture today, we're going to talk about minority voices in the American religious experience, and we're going to talk about Native Americans more specifically, and how they approached what was going on in the United States with the emergence of greater numbers of white European Americans coming over and expanding into new territories, and how the Native Americans responded. And primarily, how they responded was through the prism of their religion. So we'll talk about that towards the end of this lecture. So for the first part, we need to talk about what was the roots of the early new religious movements in America. And for that, we really need to talk about the Second Great Awakening in American religious history. So let's dive right in. So let's talk about the Second Great Awakening. So following the Revolution and the passage of the United States Constitution, Western migration, what we really mean by Western migration at this time, was typically the land that was west of the Appalachian Mountains. So the mountain range that runs from really lower part of upstate New York and western Pennsylvania, all the way down to uh, really northeast Alabama. And so it's this mountain range that comprises of the Great Smoky Mountains, that is, into East Tennessee, or the Blue Ridge Mountains in Georgia and North and South Carolina as well. So it's these lands that were just west of the Appalachian Mountains and still east of the Mississippi River. We're not really talking about California at this point or Colorado, but rather the Ohio River Valley, or that's Ohio, Indiana, parts of Illinois, upstate Michigan, as well as Kentucky, Tennessee, and beginnings of the states of Alabama and Mississippi. So this is what was considered at one period of time the West, or sometimes we refer to it as simply the American frontier. But after the Revolutionary War, with the Treaty of Versailles and the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, we begin to see a stampede of Americans flowing towards Western lands, going over the mountains, going to lands that had previously, prior to the Revolution, had been denied to them by the Quebec Act between following the defeat of the French during the French and Indian Wars, or sometimes known as the Seven Years' War. Those lands beyond the Appalachian was considered territory that was to remain a buffer zone, or a land that was given primarily over to the Indians and various French traders who had occupied these territories. But now, following the war, vast numbers of Americans started to move west. And so, for example, with even my own family's tradition, my family, particularly my father's side, last name Stewart, came over from Scotland in 1736 and landed in what is today North Carolina, landed in the Wilmington area and up along the Cape River area, and eventually, after the Revolution, a lot of my family went immediately west and towards Mississippi and Tennessee and settled there because of that. So, my family had direct connections with the same basic pattern of those Americans that were moving west. However, with this westward expansion, it left those people back east with a lot of great concern, because more and more Americans were moving westward, because of endless opportunity in land, endless opportunity in economics for a lot of these Americans. And so there was a great concern among those back east because, again, you were so many people fleeing the east for new opportunities. The fear was that they were being removed from civilizing effects. And so living out in the frontier, living out in the harsh wilderness of the American frontier would end up this kind of fear that European Americans would kind of revert back to barbarism, because that is what they had seen and experienced from, or what their ideology was of the Native Americans. They were fearful that because they were a lack of civilization, a lack of Christian influences, the establishment of churches per se, that many people that moved out west would just subvert to barbarism. They would ultimately would subvert moral order and society, because in fact it was the church at this time who was the arbiter of morality. And so there's a lack of churches out west, a lack of missionaries out west, and so there was this just great fear. And there was also some political misgivings as well. People in the East was so fearful that because, again, of this rising new popularity of people moving out west, that the people out west will eventually supplant in numbers those in the East. And so the power struggle would shift from the more established East Coast to now what is known as the West, but really the Midwest. Um, so there was this just great fear. So what did the eastern portions of the United States do? In response, they believed, well, we need to civilize societies out west. We need to bring Christian influences from the east, Christian establishments that have been, almost 200 years in the making at this point, starting in the 1800s. Nearly 200 years of Christian establishments, we need to bring them out west. So they started to send missionaries and ministers out west. So again, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, these types of territories, to establish churches. And so it was this belief that if we sent missionaries, if we sent ministers out west, that we would solve the problem and thus create a solution, that we would civilize those ones out west. And how we do that is we make them like us back east, make them Protestant, make them similar. So Protestant churches started sending missionaries in the purpose of making them more and more like the East. However, what emerged was in fact a new Great Awakening, a new revival that emerged, known as the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening is typically identified from starting in the 1800s. Some people put it all the way back to the 1790s. I'm more comfortable with the 1800s, and some people will extend it all the way until the 1850s, but I typically cut it off, at the start of the 1840s, with the Second Great Awakening. Some people say 1845. It really doesn't matter at this point. It's about a 30 to 50 year period. We're not really sure, but the impetus of it was really in this 30-year period. And so the Second Great Awakening really started and has been attributed to much of the frontier revivals and camp meetings that were going on in the Ohio River Valley. So Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, those places out what is known as, quote unquote, the West or the frontier. So the source of these meetings, these camp meetings, these camp revivals, the source of these camp meetings came from the massive amount of Scotch-Irish immigrants who came to America. And of course, like many immigrants who come to America, they bring with them their traditions from their native homelands. And one of these particular traditions that the Scotch-Irish brought with them was the traditional Presbyterian sacrament known as these holy fairs or these gatherings that they would come together with. So while I just thought about it, I want to make sure and clarify at this point. When I'm talking about Irish immigrants, I'm really talking about here at this point in American history, those who came from Northern Ireland. And so, if you guys are not aware, many of you guys are probably way too young to remember the religious wars that had consumed the island of Ireland for almost over 100 years between Protestants and Catholics battling each other out. I can vaguely remember the period known as the Troubles from the 1980s all the way up until 1996, 98 that is known as the Troubles, where you had the IRA, these Irish Republican terrorists going in the streets, shooting cops, shooting police officers, kidnapping people, all because of Irish and Protestants fighting each other over religion, as well as fighting each other over political unity. Most of the Irish who were Catholic wanted a united country, a united Ireland under the Republic of Ireland, but those who typically were Protestants reside in Northern Ireland and typically favored their continuation of being members of the United Kingdom or being part of the Union with Great Britain. And so there have been a long history of Protestants in the northern territories of Northern Ireland that really didn't exist at this point, versus the rest or the southern portions of Ireland that coincided with Catholicism. So at this point in American immigration, Irish who are coming to America were so far Protestants. Really, starting in the 1830s and 40s, we start seeing a wave of Catholic Irish coming, and the response to these Catholic Irishes were quite different. But at this point in time, the Scotch Irish were pretty much Protestants, very similar, traditionally Presbyterian, possibly small influences of Anglicanism here, but not so much at this point. But they were pretty much welcome. And so my family is a part of this movement as well, being Scotch Irish background. We came to America during the same kind of movement that many of these Scotch Irish immigrants came. And so when they came, they brought with them this tradition of holy fairs. And so what are holy fairs? Fairs being FAIRS, like county fairs or state fairs that we typically have. These were large gatherings that would happen periodically, either on a Holy Saints' Day within the Church of Scotland or the Church of Ireland. And they would be, couple of day festivals, sometimes 4 to 7 day festivals, where a lot of games were played, but within it would always be church services were a major part of the holy fairs. And so typically there was this bringing about of the practice of the sacrament, having Holy Communion, and then also tied with it sermons and revivals that would go on with it. And so these were periodically. Sometimes it'd be once a year, sometimes it would be twice a year. We've had some traditions here in America of 4 times a year with Scotch Irish immigrants coming over. So this was a very common tradition that they brought with them. Because typically Scotland and Ireland, for a large portion of its history, was very much farmland and very much kind of nomadic lifestyles, communities, spread out very far distances. And so when times communities came together, they would only come together during these holy fairs. And so it made very sense for many of these Scotch Irish who moved to Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Ohio territories, out in the frontier. This is what they were kind of used to. And so, as a way to promote community, was they would host these holy fairs. And so, this is kind of the impetus of these revival camp meetings that would eventually spur on the Great Awakening. Another impetus for the Second Great Awakening was the preaching and organization of a fiery Presbyterian minister. There's not too many fiery Presbyterian ministers out there, but there was one more specifically, James McGready, who was from North Carolina territory, uh, who was very flamboyant, very emotional in his style of preaching, so much so that the local communities there in North Carolina actually asked him to leave several times because he was too emotional, too fiery, too personality driven within his sermons. And so James wanted to, basically he was looking for communities that would accept him. And so eventually he found success out in the American frontier, more specifically in Logan County, Kentucky. And so he brought his style of sermon, his style of preaching that kind of mirrored that of the First Great Awakening, very emotional driven, very fiery in its presentation, brought it with him to these Scotch Irish immigrants out in Kentucky. And according to James McCready's own autobiographies, he was very successful in Kentucky. We have certain excerpts that he would talk about his time in Logan County. So one excerpt from his biography or his journals would say that, quote, the Spirit of God was poured out abundantly during his work. He said typically his congregations became quote unquote intensely interested on the subject of religion that they almost entirely neglected their secular affairs. That meaning basically that preaching became people became so obsessed with having church services out in the frontier, because again, technically, out in the frontier there was no institutions, there was no civic order. It was vast communities that were loosely connected because of immigration, or loosely connected because of trade, and maybe some kind of tie to an American military fort, like Pittsburgh or St. Louis, or Chattanooga, where area and eventually Knoxville in Tennessee, were areas where first they were military forts before they became cities. And so there was some small connections, and so he said people were just so starved for his style of preaching and this um, very religious fervor that people would just completely neglect their farms in order to stay and listen to his sermons. And so this kind of set up a great movement that would eventually happen. So eventually, in the summer of 1800, McGready decided to organize a series of revivals throughout the very northern regions of Kentucky along the Ohio River Valley. And ultimately, he organized these revivals. He brought circuit ministers back from the East that he knew of and that was young ministers like himself, to come to Kentucky to preach, and that there eventually would be a grand revival meeting at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. This kind of take the same example of these holy fair meetings, but he brought it to Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Well, he it was so successful that eventually at one point around 1800 to 1801, that eventually these little small revival meetings grew to about 25,000 people coming and reportedly to attend these outdoor revival meetings. So 25,000 people doesn't sound too much. This sounds like a political rally nowadays during a presidential election. You'll hear, the Democratic candidates say that they had 20 to 30 something thousand in a basketball arena, or at a convention center. But you have to think about at this time period, 25,000 people. At the time of 1800, if I recall right from census data, because the U.S. Census happened during this time, that the state of Tennessee reported around 75,000 people in the entire state of Tennessee. Kentucky, close to 100,000 people. So 25,000 people is a significant and a massive amount of people coming to one revival meeting. That that they had to build cabins and they had to build new styles of presentation for these types of meetings, and people would come from all over Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky. But eventually, we had people coming from the east, traveling all the way out to, the frontier to have these great awakening experiences. And it became all over the news. And so we have reports from newspapers in Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way up to Buffalo, New York, and then eventually to New York City itself. Reports of women shouting and crying out for mercy. People exhorted to let the Lord omnipotent reign in their hearts. The floor covered with the slain, their screams for mercy that pierced the heavens. It was very much a spectacle, but very much this type of revival-esque type meeting out in Cambridge, Kentucky, way out in the frontier. And so, because of this, because of the beginnings of this camp frontier camp style revival meetings, really three major outcomes emerged from the Cane Ridge revivals, besides just the Second Great Awakening. The first was that hundreds of ministers either came to these revivals because they heard about them, or several people became ministers and had conversion experiences at these meetings and then subsequently became ministers at these events. So in turn that they would go out and go back to the east or go back to Tennessee or Alabama, back to Indiana, these territories at these times, and they would perform revival meetings as well. And so you had the beginnings of the spreading of American Protestantism out further in the West. Also, because of the nature of these members, many Scotch Irish, when they came to America, they sort of, abandoned their Presbyterian style of leadership, and we'll talk about this, or their Presbyterian style of church services, and they actually became more and more Baptist or Methodist in their denomination or their affiliation, because very quickly, even though McGready was a Presbyterian minister, he could not get fellow Presbyterian ministers to come out to the frontier with him. The Presbyterian Church actually degraded what James McCready was doing. And instead, the only ministers that he could get out to the frontier were Methodist and Baptist. And so when they're preaching their revivals, more and more people, instead of becoming Presbyterian like James McGready, they were becoming more and more Baptist or Methodist, growing in these regions. So church membership started to grow out in the frontier and out in Ohio, Tennessee, and the Mississippi River valleys, and they became dominated by Baptists and Methodists. And so it was why to much of these regions today, they are still dominated by these two major denominations. And this is where both Baptist and Methodist at the start of the First Great Awakening were seen as outsiders because of their preaching towards African Americans or because of their emotional stance and beliefs and practices during their church services. Now, Methodists and Baptists became the dominant form of Protestant denominationalism in America because of the Second Great Awakening. This was the experiences that everyone was having, and so most of these ministers were Baptist and Methodist in origins, and they're training fellow like Baptist and Methodist ministers to go out and preach the Gospels. So you had the spreading of these denominations, which would in turn become two of the biggest of the American Protestant denominations in America, more so the Baptist denomination now being the largest of the Protestant movement. But also because of that, and I've kind of already hinted at it, this Second Great Awakening caused really the first American denominational split among Presbyterians. Many of the Presbyterians were kind of hierarchical They were kind of reserved in the way they saw church to be done. But now you're having emotional experiences. You're having women shouting for mercy. You had people exhorting, God to come and save them, crying out. People covered on the floors covered with people being quote unquote slain in the spirit. Are people screaming at these sessions for mercy, for God to forgive them? And so this again, famous painting of a Methodist camp-like meeting so much later in the 1830s, where these kinds of styles of revivals became transported and became commonplace. You can see this is a eyewitness account of one of these meetings, and you can see people falling down, women raising their hands, screaming out to heaven, people just falling everywhere, with a dynamic preacher preaching emotional response type sermons. And so this became commonplace among the American frontier. And so that's why, in the American South, this is very much commonplace as well. Whether the churches you go to, you'll have these similar experiences. But however, for the Presbyterian churches, they did not deem this as acceptable behavior, and they were highly questionable of emotional responses to faith. And so, thus, you had many of the Presbyterian churches back east deny licensure to many of the ministers that were emerging out of the Camp Ridge or Cane Ridge revival ceremonies. And thus you have a split between the Presbyterian Church in America, with those who accepted what was going on, and those Presbyterians who accepted with what was going on out in Kentucky became known as the Cumberland Presbyterians, which now have kind of died off, but you can find them here and there in East Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky and northern parts of Alabama and Mississippi. You can still find some Cumberland-style Presbyterians, but they have their beginning roots with the Second Great Awakening. But however, the Presbyterian Church suffered its first really denominational split, and it was over the facts of emotionalism within religion. People saw this as dangerous because of the types of responses that people have. Typically, rational systems of thought were seen as suspecting of the Second Great Awakening movements. So we had the emergence of the Second Great Awakening, but in retrospect, really three ideas really helped shape the movement, and both also shaped and reflect American religion as well as American culture. And the first that helped produce the Second Great Awakening was this influence from not here in America, but would solely come to America. And that is the influence of a philosophical movement known as, realism, or sometimes better known as Scottish common sense philosophy. And so, what Scottish common sense philosophy, or sometimes common sense realism, is known for, it emphasizes man's innate ability to perceive common ideas. And that, man is inherently knows certain facts to be true. That man is not completely a blank slate, that he doesn't have to be taught everything, that man does have some things that are innately within him, and his ability to perceive common idealisms that are both universal. So say you take, if you are an explorer and you travel to one of the far Pacific islands in the 17th and 18th century, you will still come across a society and culture where killing somebody is universally wrong. Now killing another rival or killing a perceived enemy is okay. Self-defense seems to be okay based off these tribal societies versus, our British or European societies. But yet killing somebody within your own community, within your own tribe, is still seen as a major no-no. Well, if European society is built upon this idea of the Ten Commandments, of, Judeo-Christian values, and, it is because of the Ten Commandments we know, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, but yet we can go to a community out in the Pacific Islands, way out in Fiji and Bora Bora and all these various native islands, and we can see the same type of premise on display, the same type of moralism on display within these native cultures. And yet they have never heard, never been exposed to Christianity. So thus it left many philosophers and scientists to talk about, well, is it true that the Christian church is a source of morality? So with the Scottish realist group of philosophers or common sense philosophers like Thomas Reid, like of Alex Smith or Dougal Stewart, some of these top Scottish philosophers, what they in turn realized is that there's certain idealisms that are universally true within nature and within humanity. And it's because of man's innate ability to perceive these common ideas as inherent truth. It's inherently true and inherently a good practice not to covet your neighbor's wife, not to steal from your neighbor, not to bear false witness, to lie against your neighbor. It's just inherently common sense. It's within us, and so we don't have to be taught these basic values. We just interpretly know what it is. And so because we can inherently interpret within these basic universal truths, there's something within us as humans, according to this philosophy, that we can judge things to be correctly true. And so this is where we get natural law from, these ideas. And so this type of philosophy was highly influential upon our early founding fathers, like James Madison, like Thomas Jefferson, like Dr. Benjamin Rush and James Madison, people who either signed or helped sign the Declaration of Independence or helped craft the Constitution of the United States. They pulled many of our ideas about American individuality, about American liberty, from many of the Scottish common sense philosophers. That inherent, our Declaration says that man is inherently created by God to be equal to each other and other men. That someone who is in fact a colonialist, who was born in America, has the exact same expectations of rights as those who are born in London in the UK. Who is, those same types of rights are to be expected universally. That man has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and those truisms are inherently true beyond governments, beyond religion. And so many of our founding fathers subscribed to much of common sense philosophy. And in fact, during this time, shortly after, really shortly during and after the American Revolution, this system of thought was taught predominantly within the American system, particularly Princeton Seminary, which was founded by a bunch of Scottish immigrants, and eventually would lead to the establishment much later on by the 1880s and 1890s to America's own system of philosophy of thought, pragmatism. And so the great American philosophers, William James and John Dewey, who created the American system of thought known as pragmatism, that becomes a bedrock of American diplomacy going forward and helps create America as one of the greatest economically advanced society in human history because of the doctrine of pragmatism. But it has its roots back to Scottish common sense philosophy. But however, for our purposes, so despite philosophy and despite ethics and stuff like that, for our purposes, rather, what these philosophers argued for is the fact that they perceived that human activity, that human understanding was in fact wasn't just one thing, but it was a collaboration of three things. that how we can perceive and come to knowledge is a combination of three faculties. Our individual inherent intelligence, our ability to read and comprehend and understand things, our own physical will, our own ability to act out things and practice things in our own daily lives. But the key part here for us and for the Second Great Awakening was the idea that humanity knows something to be true, not because of just our mere knowledge and book not smarts, and not because of we can physically touch it and perceive it and practice it and repeat it, the scientific method here, but also they tied in with emotions. That we understand, that we comprehend, that we choose things based off emotions. So it's that emotions were vastly critical for the intellectual activity, for your ability to choose and comprehend, to understand something to be true. So why would that make sense here in a religious context? Because again, for what we'll see here, the Second Great Awakening was all about creating an emotional response. So if you can't understand something, you do not have the ability to understand anything without an emotional experience. And so thus many of the preachers wanted to create that emotional response for you to and produce, therefore, a decision and reaction. So a common example of this is because people typically choose moral causes because of an emotional motivation. So let's think of an example. A moral cause. So typically why many of us want to donate money to something like the Salvation Army or donate time and resources to the Red Cross isn't because of it makes logical sense, because of some philosophical argument that we heard on the street corner, and that we said, yeah, that makes complete sense because of your logic, because of the way you argue, will therefore support you. No. Typically, during Christmas time, we put money into the bucket of the guy ringing the bell for Salvation Army, or why we donate clothes or blood to the Red Cross. It's because of an emotional response, an emotional motivation. We don't like to see people suffer, because possibly we ourselves suffered at one time and we want someone to be there for us if we're ever at this situation. So typically we choose morality not because of logic, but because of an emotional response. And the same thing we have with usually religion, that people typically talk about their religion. They don't talk about their religion in logical terms, in logical treatises of why they believe what they believe. Rather, they talk about their faith in Islam or their faith in Buddhism or their faith in Christianity because of an emotional experience. Because the first time that they attended a prayer meeting at the local mosque and prayed the Salah, or the Shada, for a Muslim, of someone who goes to their very first church service and then has an emotional response to the music and to the sermon, and they talk about that they felt something. They don't talk about the logistics or the logic argument of the preacher. Rather, they always talk about an emotional response. So again, people choose religion because of an emotional response. So thus, the impetus for the Second Great Awakening resided within this kind of philosophy that gave it ammo, that people choose religion because of an emotional response. So therefore, as we'll talk about a little bit here in the second point, we needed to facilitate an emotional response. We need to create it. Thus, with missionary activities or with planned style sermons or planned responses later on that we'll get to talk about later. But eventually, for American religion, it kind of blends the previous sentiment of the first Great Awakening, that you need to have piety, that you had to need to have this pious attitude with your emotional piety, blended it now with the waves of the second Great Awakening that was emotional reasoning and emotional action. That not only was the first Great Awakening very much individualistic in what it pointed out, to now it is response beyond the self, which will help set up for the abolitionist movement that really picked up because of the Second Great Awakening, or late 19 or 1840s, the push towards women's rights, but eventually fades away after the Seneca Falls in 1848. But they had their moments and their roots due to the Second Great Awakening because of social causes like this, that now combining emotional piety with emotional reasoning and action. So this is kind of the definition of the American religious experience, emotional piety and action. And so the second Great Awakening wedded emotional reactions with religious understanding. So thus very common during this period was this kind of very basic sentiment here. To feel is to know. And that was the sign of a successful conversion. And what's the sign of a Christian? As if they had an emotional response, being born again. And so we'll eventually see the later appeal of new religious movements that aim to help facilitate an emotional response. So what else? What else can we talk about here? So we had the influences of Scottish common sense, but then also the idea that revivals can be a tool, or a better yet, a means to an end. And so what I mean by that is, so within concert to Scottish realism, many religious leaders saw that revivals can be used as a social force, that revivals themselves are a social force of change and response in a given society. And so because religious leaders saw revivals as impetus, as we saw from the East, wanting to civilize the frontier, the American frontier, out west, to prevent barbarism, prevent the people from going native, quote unquote, or prevent the people from disestablishing what the Americans in the East just had finished rebuilding. They saw that revival can be a tool that can be performed and manipulated to produce a certain outcome. So now revivals, why the Second Great Awakening is so important, is because now the revivals became manufactured, became producible. They came down to a science. And what do I mean by that? Well, you might read, I think you probably encounter it in Corrigan's textbook, but in very early on, one of Yale University early presidents, Timothy Dwight in Connecticut, observed among his students how revival could change the behavior and attitudes of his own student population. That they had he recorded previously years of ineptitude among his ministers and his students at the University or Yale College, and so thus he brought about a series of revivals and used revivals as a tool to change the behavior of his students and of his class, to outlaw certain behaviors, because now there was a religious fervor among his students, and to move them towards apathy. And so he saw the great success at Yale College, and so he thus decided to use that technique for his own political interests. And so he tried to use revivals as a political means, as a means to create a mobilization behind the community to resist the state of Connecticut's time and effort to de-establish the Congregationalist Church in Connecticut. And Timothy Dwight, during his lifetime, was very successful in doing this because he used revival meetings to stoke up anger and fear among the population to resist this movement. But however, shortly after Timothy Dwight died, I think in 1818 or 1819, Connecticut reversed its decision and de-established the Congregationalist Church as the um, state church of the state of Connecticut. So it was very popular. But then it was ultimately one particular revivalist in Western New York, Charles Finley, who heard of these camps while he was living out in the western ports of New York, close to Pennsylvania. They heard of the success of these camps out in Kentucky and Ohio, and he went out there. He actually physically went out there, studied them, saw what observed one of these movements, and he believed that many of the techniques that was used could actually be brought back from the frontier and reduplicated, and he could reduplicate these same experiences in an urban setting with just some minor tweakings. And so Charles Finley had a very strong attitude towards what he thought Christianity should be like, what an American Protestant should be like. Finney's attitude was that people are to be what he would call Christians, but Christians in earnest, that there was no half time, there was no part time, that you had to be fully committed. And he would say that the type of people that he looked for, that he would preach for, is that Christians were the type of people to, quote, pull men out of the fire. And that they should never be, quote, so indifferent to the eternal fate of their fellow man, that they should live a life totally consumed with the preservation and the preaching of the gospel. And so he advocated this type of new system. And so when he brought this system back to Western New York, he believed that these revival meetings, these camp revival meetings, could actually be perfected into an art and into a science, and that it could be manufactured. And he would call these attempts his quote unquote new measures that could be followed and could be repeated, and he would actually train ministers to do exactly what he did. And so this is typically what he would do. And so Charles Finley was probably the most successful of these revivalists during the Second Great Awakening because of his new measure techniques. And it would follow this basic pattern every single time, and he popularized it, and he would actually sort of sell it to other ministers for them to reduplicate, and people would come to train under him. Eventually he helped establish a college out in Ohio, Oberlin College, in Ohio, to train ministers to repeat this process over and over again wherever they would go. And so he made revivalism become a science. So this was his basic pattern. Was first he would mobilize a specific group of volunteers, and so particularly he always aimed at college-age kids, and also particularly local women populations who were staying at home on the farmstead. And so he would mobilize them and specify them as groups, because we all know college age kids are very enthusiastic, are very much go-getters, very simplistic in their minds and in the way they're thinking, and are easily to become zealots for a certain cause. And women, because they had times on their hands, and then too, women at this time, because they weren't working, had connections with other women's spouses and could work on their husbands and work on other people within the community to get them to be part of the movement or get them to attend one of these revivals. So he would get a specific group of volunteers that would basically go door to door or town to town and recruit people and tell people about the upcoming revival. And so number two, typically Charles Finley would also garner many media attention. He would actually invite, if he was, say, for example, if he was doing a revival in Rochester, New York, in upstate Western New York, And the next town that he was going to go to for his next revival would be Utica, New York, which is near Rochester. He would in turn invite the newspaper from Utica to come. He would pay the personal expenses, buy their meals, or he would buy their hotel rooms and have them come and cover the revivals for their own hometown paper. It was kind of his way of doing social media. Get the attention and get the media on your side to create a buzz in before the town you would go to. And so this was a very common practice. He would also write, sort of, this was kind of early forms of op-ed. That was really in the Third Great Awakening where op-eds kind of became more popular. But he would kind of write personal messages to get people to read about his events that were coming up to create excitement and stir interest. And so by the time he was ready to come, the community was already set ablaze of what was going on. Third was that you had to have a charismatic style of preaching, and you had to have a charismatic style of personality style. Charles Finley was that. Charles Finley was larger than life in his attitude and in his preaching. There were stories about him that he would stand on stages, and he would have stages built up high, and he would also stand on top of the railings while he was preaching, or he would go out in the midst of the crowd while he was preaching, which was unheard of at this time because typically ministers were quite reserved, or they were quite stationary in their preaching, that they would have notes memorized and they would read their lectures, and they were very oratory driven. His were all memorized speeches, and he was actually, prior to becoming a minister, he was a salesman. So you can see some of this salesmanship in his style. And so his sermons were quite short. They were quite pitchy. They had turns of phrases in them that were easily to be memorized and understand, to help repeat and have other people be able to tell the stories about what they would heard. They would hear the message, and so people could understand his messages quite clearly. He would also personalize sermons. He would learn, he would have some of his volunteers learn the names of individuals that were going to be invited, and he would direct his sermons towards these individuals. He had some of his volunteers research about some of these individuals in order to, craft a type of sermon directly aimed at this individual who would thus have an emotional response. He would also have another way to personalize his sermons or his worship was that he would have what was known as anxious boxes, or anxious benches is what they were sometimes known as. These kind of front row benches up here where they would put, he would have his volunteers put specific people on this front bench. And you can see the style here that Charles Finley, he's not so much preaching to the choir, to the groups out here, but he's preaching directly to those in front of them, pointing at them, calling them by names, getting their attention, and thus preaching convicting style sermons towards his audiences. And he would have audience participation, where if someone would start breaking down and crying, he would immediately stop his sermons, bring them up on stage, and then ask them, why are you crying? And people would talk about they had this newfound religious experience, how they were so sorry. They would start confessing their sins out in front of everybody, and it would get people's attention because they're like, well, I've got that sin, and oh, that's Johnny? I can't believe Johnny's up there and he's getting saved. Maybe I need to get saved as well. And you would have these kind of experiences. Because again, you can see every step of this is all about creating an emotional response, getting you to say yes, getting you to become, quote unquote, a born again believer. The last thing Finley would also do was that while he was at his sermons, he would typically, you can see people behind him, they were actually students at local seminaries. He would get seminary students involved in much of his training, and they would be taking notes on his sermon style, of how he was doing things, and he would offer himself as he was, a teacher teaching other people to mirror what he was doing. And so, thus, after they were finished with their trainings and he was finished with the revivals at his town, he would say, now you go and do likewise. Go out to the neighboring village and preach a revival. And so you can see he created an entire system. So we see religion in America becomes like a business very early on in the Second Great Awakening. And so again, religion gets exposed to the free market. So this is what happens to the free market. To become viable, you need people to respond to it and to eat it up and to buy it out. So one way to do it, create emotional response. And Charles Finley does that. So number 3, so we talked about Scottish realism, this kind of philosophy that becomes ingrained in American culture, but then bleeds into the religious experience. We see revivals becoming a tool, a social tool, a means to an end. But also in America, we see the reestablishment of Christian institutions that were vital to the community. So, which is interesting because just prior to the Second Great Awakening, the American religious communities had fought a revolutionary war in order to de-establish themselves from, what I say here, maybe this is too strong, but kind of the stranglehold that the church had on local governance. But what I mean is that instead of the stranglehold, rather it was this tight grip that the church had on local governance. That again, morality was seen as being something from the church and being brought from the church. And civilization, we see that the people in the East, what they thought as these frontier people, that they don't have civilization. So what do? They send, instead of judges and send police officers out west, they send ministers because people out in the East equivalated civilization with the church and vice versa. So we have that being held. And so prior to the Second Great Awakening, we were trying, as American people, trying to disestablish ourselves from the church's control over society, where you had the freedom to make up your mind. Now, we see what was the East doing? They were sending people to establish the church out west, to establish their form of church out west. And so first, the Presbyterian church tried, but then when the Second Great Awakening happened, and the church out west was becoming nothing like the Presbyterian church out in the east, instead of embracing it and enjoying it, what happened with the Presbyterian church? They divided, they split, because they said, well, that's not the kind of church we want. And so they basically cross their hands and shake their head and say, nope, 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 you need to get out of here. And so what happens is people went elsewhere for church and for their connection. So it's interesting that we see that during the 1790 U.S. Census, Charles Lippe, one of the other great church historians in America, he noted that within this data of the first U.S. Census, 1790, the first census ever being constructed, that only about 10% of the populace at the time claimed a church membership. And the reason is because many churches were without ministers for so long. Because of the war, because so much of the institutions where religion was being taught was from England. So ministers had to come from England because they were being licensed and certified by the crown, because universities like Oxford and Cambridge were great bastions of training ministers, as well as later Harvard University and Yale University were bastions of creating ministers. And so with now England being cut off after the Revolutionary War, there was a true lack of ministers out, that there wasn't enough ministers to supply the need. And so church membership started to die off. So if the church was to survive now with the free market, it needed an infusion of emotional responses for people to support it. People had to have a need. And so thus, this is where the Second Great Awakening comes about. you needed to have an emotional response to in order to support the church. You realize I need the church. I need the church's community in order to respond. And also at work, the church, it was kind of recognized too during this period and for really much of American society that the church was a civil institution. It was a social force for civilizing communities. Very much so, you can go back in many of these frontier territories, many of these ministers operated as educated people. They were sometimes the educators in the local village or town, so that they would train the children in basic general education requirements, mathematics, how to read, how to write, things like that, as well as preach to the local congregation. So the churches very early on out in the frontier were the first public schools. Many of the early churches out in the frontier were also places where court was routinely held, where judges and magistrates would often hold court at, because there wasn't many buildings, no centralized area that can hold a lot of people. There's also various wills, people writing wills or doing contracts or trades of goods, that we have early signs out in the frontier territory where ministers were often seen as witnesses of the signatures. For that, one of my family members, I've got, when I did my genealogy out in East Felicia Parish in Louisiana, one of my relatives bought land from his father-in-law, Brashear, and who signed the bill of sale was a minister. It wasn't a judge, but it was the local minister who signed the bill of sale as proof that this bill is legitimate. So again, out in the country, out in Louisiana in 1803, before Louisiana is even purchased by the United States, we have this bill of sale with my own family. So you can see the churches operated as a civilizing institution. And so because of the Second Great Awakening and because of its success out west, there became a greater need for religious institution and religious institutional support to keep the expansion of the revival efforts going. And so thus, denominational missionary society groups started to emerge and pop up everywhere out in the East to send money to support out West. And they were typically run and operated and organized by women. Because it was oftentimes, and even till this day, it's women who typically are the backbones of American culture or its society in general, of the family unit. It's the woman who is the backbones, not the man. And so typically this is one way that women began to flex their muscles and eventually start to push for, the right to vote in 1848, was because of the Second Great Awakening, that they became empowered by these missionary efforts, and they were in charge of communities, having to give speeches, having to write letters for money and organization. And so we have this effort. So this is another effort at civilizing or reestablishing the Christian institutions within these communities. Also, frontier colleges were being created and needed to be created in order to train ministers that were being so desperately needed because of these large revival movements. And so really from 1803 all the way till 1806, here in 1860, sorry, in America, the frontiers. This is meaning Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Arkansas, Louisiana. This is what we're talking about, this period here with this data, that less than 60 years, over 516 colleges were created by the churches, by denominations. So I'll give you an example. Rutgers University in New Jersey was a denominational school created by the Presbyterians. So let's look at example just down the road, Florida State University. Florida State University, its roots was a missionary school, was a frontier college missionary seminary school. before it shut down due to the Civil War and then repurposed itself to be an all-women's college. My alma mater, one of my bachelor's degrees, alma mater was Carson Newman University in Jefferson City, Tennessee. It was founded by Baptists during the Second Great Awakening. And, two colleges that emerged, one for men and one for women. Carson College for men, Newman College for women. But after the Civil War, they eventually merged in together to be Carson Newman College and then later Carson Newman University. What else we have? I already mentioned Oberlin College. You had, trying to remember some of the ones. They're kind of escaping me right now. Sanford University in Birmingham was a Christian college. Rhodes College in Memphis, a Christian college. Um, Mercer University in Georgia came a little bit later, but it was also because of the Second Great Awakening. College, Christian college. Belmont University in Nashville, a Christian college. So many. I mean, the list can go on. 500 universities now in colleges had their roots of being denominationally created because of the Second Great Awakening. So you can see the reestablishment of Christian institutions in America as vital sources of community. But for most of all, a belief emerged out of the revivals that applying Christian teachings to social ills could resolve social problems. And so we're getting to see the birth of Christian activism that would be later picked up in the 1840s and 50s with the abolitionist movement, then later in the 1880s and 90s with the social gospel movement and the progressive era that we'll eventually talk about. So during the Second Great Awakening, people literally believed in what Jesus prayed in the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. People started in America to start taking that phrase quite literally. That this is, instead of a prayer, this was a command by Jesus. That thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so, like I said, we have the beginnings of Christian socialist activism having its roots within the Second Great Awakening. It slowly took off, again with the abolitionist movement, but it picks up later in the 1880s and 90s, and we'll talk about that. So now we finished with talking about the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, and so now we're going to talk about the new religious movements that have begun merging in the United States. So real briefly, we need to do a quick survey about these religious movements and how they can be summarized and characterized here in the United States. So in the first half of the 19th century in the United States many historians see it as a time of eager expectations or unbridled enthusiasm, as I have here, or just kind of this relentless ferventness that consumed everybody. And so we see that. We see that with certain reports. And so one of the most famous reports and one of the most famous European visitors that came to America was Alexa de Tocqueville, who famously wrote his book Democracy in America and how he categorized and popularized America democracy and why is it working in America where it failed miserably in France. And he talks a lot about religion in America, and he was impressed and surprised. In one quote, he talks about that he was impressed by the popularity and the vigor of conventional religion in America. Because in Europe, religion was abandoned very quickly. That France attempted to have a revolutionary style revolt similar to what happened in America, but the French Revolution took a great and significant turn than that of the American one. And Tocqueville was just impressed and amazed at everybody seemed to be religious. And he's coming to America in the 1820s during the heart of the Second Great Awakening. And he writes about, again, that he's just amazed that everybody can get along religiously. People have different wild and crazy beliefs, but yet it moves and it works and it's going on. And so he was also struck. Many other Europeans, like Tocqueville, was also struck by the way that he talks about how many new ways to heaven were being fashioned in America. That it wasn't strictly to the church, but we have what he's talking about here is really new religious movements. And he says, by the strenuous efforts others gave in creating a heavenly existence and an earthly embodiment. It's supposed to be in an earthly embodiment, not an earthly embodiment. Um, but he was talking about it, this phrase, that he's talking about new religious movements that in America, and he was just awed by how this could happen here in America. And of course, he credits it to American style of democracy. But so let's talk about these new religious movements. And so these new religious movements are sometimes known as NRM, are typically defined by their modern origins. So anytime we talk about a new religious movement, we classify it because it was created here recently, within the last 200 years. So, for example, Mormonism is kind of defined as a new religious movement in that it was created in the last 200 years history of the United States of America. Scientology is a new religious movement because it was created in the 1950s by Ron L. Hubbard. Not Scientology, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh Day Adventist here in America, all again created relatively early in um, in terms of time and significance. So this is why we typically define them as something other, is because again, primarily it is of their modern origins, but also their peripheral of their existence on the outside of society. So for a very long time, Mormonism was seen as something other than American, but now because of Mormonism popularity and growth here in America, that they're now part of the American fabric. But yet Scientology is still kind of seen as other because they just haven't had time to be popularized here in America. But then, like Jehovah's Witness, again, somebody that's been here for well over 100 years, close to 150 years, but still has maintained kind of as a social oddity within our society. So again, it's either defined by its modern origins or kind of its existence on the on the outside of typical American dominant religious experiences. So why did they really begin? So Tocqueville says that it's because of democracy, American style democracy, that why these new religious movements have emerged here in America. However, um, typical scholars say that's not true. They actually point to really two important factors that combine to produce these unusual new religious movements that only occur here in America. Why did Mormonism only occur here in America? Why couldn't it occur out in Russia? Why couldn't Jehovah's Witnesses emerge in Germany? Why couldn't Seventh Day Adventism emerge in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil? Why does it have to emerge here in America? And so historians and sociologists typically would point to two factors. And so one is Tocqueville kind of talks about this too, but he doesn't give it much credit, is the idea of an absence of tradition here in America. And so what do I mean by that? Well, frankly, America has no establishment of church, therefore it has no establishment of any type of traditions. We typically, America practices, our way of experiment. Um, we really only have the only tradition we have is of necessity, things that we need to get accomplished and need to get done. American pragmatism basically is our only tradition. So we have no traditional style of leadership, no traditional style of church or worship or conduct, and so thus we're left to experimentation because of that. Religious freedom and experimentation is not inhibited by American law. So thus we have no tradition that says, church is always to be like this and always to be conducted in this form and fashion. The law is quite clear on this, that there's freedom of expression, freedom of religion. So we have the freedom to experiment here, where versus in other countries for a long time, there was no way to experiment. The only prohibition force on religion in America has really been social norms and those traditions of the majority. And so this is kind of different as tradition of the whole, but whether as why Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness kind of for times remained on the outside of American societies because it wasn't a part of the social norm. Why Pentecostalism for a short spell in American history was seen as outside, or Catholicism, why it was seen as something outside because it wasn't part of the social norm or the traditional views and beliefs of the majority. But eventually that changes. And why Catholicism can be accepted or why Mormonism can be accepted is because the traditions, we have no clear set traditions. And that's just dependent upon demographics and social norms. So we have an absence of traditions, and also there's an abundance, the more practical reason, an abundance of cheap land. And what I could say open land here because, technically the Native Americans own this territory, but yet we took it from them. But this abundance of cheap land that is out there. And so we have previous examples of this where the Puritans, anytime they had a new movement emerged uh, in Massachusetts, a new religious group emerged, like Roger Williams and the Baptists. What happened? The Puritans just simply banished them. They said, well, you can't exist here, but you can exist over there. So why don't you, there's plenty of land, go exist and go do your crazy crap over there and don't bother us. And so what does Roger Williams do? He does that. Goes to to the territory that eventually becomes Rhode Island and creates a new safe haven for all Baptists and all religiously persecuted people from Massachusetts to come and live. That became Rhode Island. Eventually, the same thing happened later in New Hampshire. John Wheelwright was forced to abandon his beliefs and abandon his territory and his livelihood because of Puritan persecution. And thus he goes and establishes the city of Exeter in New Hampshire, and then later, eventually, the state of New Hampshire as well. So we have examples of this, that if, this is what we do, if you don't like it, just get up and leave. And so I guess that becomes the American tradition, because now we have Western expansions. And so as the West, people keep moving westward, we see an unequal, opportunity to implement and institutionalize their own new religious ideas. So again, it's no consequence to anybody for these new religious movements to exist because they could exist out in the frontier. As long as they exist out there, then we're fine with it. But as soon as they come and invade our territory, then we have an issue. And so it's because of the frontier that many of these new religious movements start emerging, and we see that. We see that because of these new American religious movements, they emerge in society here that typically they emerge within the frontier. So Mormonism out in the western frontiers of New York. Jehovah's Witness, they emerge in the frontiers of western Pennsylvania, out in the rural countries of western Pennsylvania. Scientology, out in the western territories of California. Even though by the 1950s California is very much settled, but it's still the frontier territory. It's not the traditional East. So this kind of sets the pattern for new religious movements of how they occur. They all occur primarily in new frontier territories, non-traditional areas. So now let's talk about some of these. And so these new religious movements can kind of be easily divided into really two segments at the first wave of these new religious movements. So the first are known as these utopian visions, how they emerged. And so a prominent feature among these first half of the 19th century new religious movements was these kind of rise and fall of these varietal establishments of these kind of communal societies that all emerged and that they formed these communal societies because they all were compelled by this kind of vision of what life and society could ideally be. This kind of Arminius hope and of perfectionism here and now, and that perfecting one's society could be, in fact, achievable here on earth. And so many of these new religious movement groups emerged because they had this utopian style dream of what life should be like after a religious experiment. So the first of these were known as, the most prominent of these were the Shakers. So the Shakers are a little bit different in that the Shakers didn't emerge here in America per se. And in fact, the movement is attributed to a single person and the teachings of a woman, Anne Lee, who was British, and she, was a Quaker. And Quakers in England were highly persecuted for a long period of time. However, she emerged with her teachings and her specific view out of sectarian groups of Quakers in England, but she wasn't really accepted. Shakers, they kind of get their name, their unique name, but they get their name because of a distinguishing feature about them, a distinguishing characteristic about them, and how they're described within their worship services. It's a particular feature. So this is one excerpt from an early report in the UK about a Shakers meeting. They said that, quote, people seized with a mighty trembling, with a violent agitation of the body, running and walking on the floor, and with singing and shouting, and they leaped for joy. So basically, the people were, seized with a mighty trembling. They were shaking all over. Violent agitation of the body, shaking. So quite literally, they got their name from shaking. They were the Shakers. And so the story goes about Anna Lee is that while she was in England, she reportedly said she received a vision from Jesus and from God. And that in her conversation and through her visions, she realized that she was taught about the root of all human depravity and the source of all evil on this world. And the source of evil is, in fact, sex. So, what are you to do? You to avoid it, to commit yourself to acts of extreme forms of celibacy in order to curtail the source of evil in this world. So thus, you can perfect this world and can perfect society if we are to rid ourselves of sex and the need for sex and curb those enthusiastics and can prove that society can function without the need of a man having to jump on a woman and vice versa. And so she tried to create societies in which men and women could coexist equally without ever having to perform sex. So eventually she became known as Mother Lee because of her visions and of her teachings, but however she grew unpopular in England and was forced to move to New York during the Revolutionary War out of frustrations because of the war and the society, and they wanted to prove that they can build a completely different society without guns and violence, but rather through spiritual revivals. And so during the Revolutionary War, she hosted several revivals in New York and in Massachusetts area and reportedly performed miracles. I'm not sure what kind of miracles she performed. Typically, they're always associated with healing. But anyhow, she reported, miracles were surrounded her. And she eventually started to convince her followers that she was, in fact, the second coming of Christ incarnate. That Christ, and according to her theology, it made sense that God was God the Father, God of Spirit, and that when Jesus came the first time, that God needed to be incarnated as man. And so now with Jesus' third coming back, according to the book of Revelations, or a second coming in the book of Revelations, that they needed to make the Trinity complete of human existence from the soul to man to now woman, and that Christ's second appearance will be the culmination of those things being of woman. So that she was in fact the complete manifestation of the Godhead and humanity, both Jesus being, first coming as a man and now coming again as a woman. And that because of her appearance and her appearance as Christ, again, that she had inaugurated a millennial reign of Christ, of a period of peace. And so this is now her new teaching, that they were to create within themselves a society. And so many of the Shakers in turn sought about creating for themselves communal societies out in the frontier, and to live in a society in which men and women would routinely work in order to sustain their sustenance and sustain their community, and then in the evenings would continue to worship God every day and every night. And so this was much of her life and much of the life of her first community. Eventually, after her death, the leadership passed to a male, Joseph Meacham, a close friend of hers, who reorganized the group as, instead of the Shakers, they became known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, that and being Mother Lee. And he established, self-sustaining villages where, people would grow their own crops. They would not have to depend upon society or go within society as well. And typically, the Shaker worship styles were very much charismatic. People shouting, as you say here, shouting, singing, leaping for joy, people falling on the ground, running and kicking in place on the floor. To that, he heavily regulated the charismatic styles of worship. And so instead of worship being like this during, Mother Lee's, uh, uh, you know, leadership of the community, that Shaker communities would evolve around ritualized dances instead. And so this is images of ritualized dancings that's very organized, very heavily regulated, and also, communications and activities between the sexes was also heavily regulated during this time. And the Shakers actually succeeded for a very long time. After it was around 1825, during the heart of the Second Great Awakening, that there was more than 6,000 Shakers, and then more than 20 communities stretching from New England all the way to Kentucky. Communities of Shakers living in these isolated, self-sustaining villages. They would typically recruit people, and people would be encouraged to come to their communities, and this is how they gained followers. Because again, there is no sex, therefore there is no reproduction. So communities needed to, Shakers would go out and evangelize to communities, and they had great appeal, particularly more among women than they did men. But eventually, by the 1850s, the movement started to decline. And here recently, 1992, the last Shaker community up in New Hampshire, I believe it is, closed its doors forever. And the last Shaker, as a religious organization, the last person who self-identified as a Shaker, she died not too long ago, 2017. And now the Shakers are no more. They don't exist, but they had a long period of time, a long period of history, almost 200-year history of existence here in the United States. But they have here recently officially have died out. So that's one utopian vision, the Shakers. And so they were kind of pre-Second Great Awakening, but really took off during the Second Great Awakening. But they are, again, most first prominent of these new religious movements because of their utopian style vision, and that they really succeeded here in the United States. The second group that we need to talk about of this utopian style vision were the opposite. The second most prominent group were the exact opposites of the Shaker, and they're the famous Oneida community. So many of you might know the name Oneida, maybe some of the older people within the class, or if you have grandmother, or if you're very familiar with fine cutlery or silverware. Oneida silverware, you can Google it. It's very expensive and one of the prominent, well-made cutlery ware um, diningware, tableware that you can purchase here in America, and they have their roots. A lot of people don't realize that they have their roots within a religious organization. For a very short period, for about 3 months, I actually lived in Oneida, New York, and was able to tour many of the old community where the Oneida community lived, and it's quite interesting. But anyhow, the Oneida community were complete opposite of the Shakers. And what do I mean by that? Whereas the Shakers believed in human perfection can be achieved through celibacy and physical and sexual restraint of the body and of desire, the Oneida community believed the exact opposite, that you could perfect human society through sex. And so this is what the community embraced. They embrace plurality of sexual experiences. And so much, and that's very, very much a simplified definition of this group. But however, it's very important because that's really what the Oneida community was more famous for, was that, um, we'll kind of get to it here in a minute, but they didn't really believe in restraining the senses as the Shakers did, that they were already perfected by their salvation, and thus they didn't have to restrain themselves from sin. So the origin of the group emerged from the leadership and the beliefs of John Humphrey Knowles. Knowles was actually the product of Charles Finley's revivals. He actually attended one of Charles Finley's revivals in 1831 in Western New York. And subsequently, after having a revival experience and working at one of his revivals, he subsequently enrolled into seminary. He enrolled into Harvard University, or seminary at this time, to become a minister. However, while he was in Harvard, he really studied heavily Arminian systems of thought that we already talked about. And one thing in particular that Arminian believed, that the possibility that human existence could perfect oneself. And so he started to espouse and teach weird doctrines and weird beliefs. And because of that, Harvard University actually refused his ordination as being a minister because of his beliefs. And primarily his belief that once he was saved by God, that his salvation had released him from sin. He is no longer capable of sinning ever again, because of him being saved, and that he had been perfected here in this life. And this is what was wrong with society, was that society was teaching the opposite, was teaching that you can never be perfected in this life, and thus you have to hide yourself and resist yourself of human desires and subjugate yourself. And so that's why some of the social causes in this world is being the denying yourself what the body craves and desires, particularly sex. And so, so instead, what he believed was that his new relationship with God had canceled out his obligation to obey traditional standards of morality and traditional standards of social laws in society. And thus he argued it is impossible for the church to compel a man to obey or to send him to eternal damnation, because he's not responsible to anybody now. That he is now saved by the grace of God, and that because of his salvation, he is um, perfected. And so now he's free to enjoy his life. And so he sent about, creating a new religious group in order to free themselves of this experiences. So he believed that revivals had for, um, um, he believed that the revivalists had for their great idea the regeneration of the soul as their main duty, but he saw his duty was to regenerate society. And so he thought he was the second um, like kind of the second wave of the revivalist movement. That he thought Charles Finley's job was to get people to be saved, and now his job was to go about perfecting society. And cure itself of social ills. And one of those social ills was denying itself basic rights and being subjugated to social norms. And so, because of this, and because of some of his teachings, Knowles was forced to leave Connecticut, and he, leave Massachusetts later, leave Connecticut, and then he founded a small church in Vermont in 1835 or 34. There, he instituted what he called communal practices, and where he said that one living organization before the kingdom of God. And that he extended it into all aspects of life, that everything is a communal society. So, thus, marriage is to be a part of a communal practice. So, this, of course, pissed off a lot of locals because what that meant was massive orgies among communities, and this is how they interpreted. So eventually, the locals banded together and forced Knowles and his group to leave for the western frontier of New York, and in 1846 they moved out to Oneida, New York, in the very around the Buffalo, south of Buffalo area, around the Finger Lakes in western New York, where they were safe for a very long time. So for the next 30 years, the community continued to exist and economically thrive due to their famous silverware company that they had, Oneida Silverware, that helped funded their community where they could live, within this kind of communal complex. So you can see here, this is one of the communities there, that everybody lived in these kind of dorm-shaped houses. And that they would work at the community, and the dividends of the Oneida Company would help pay for their society, so they never had it to want for anything. And so the Oneida community seemed to work for a very long time. But however, by the 1870s, Knowles and others began to be charged by the community with some harsh penalties, particularly statutory rape by many of the local officials. And many of the local college faculty there in Oneida, I think it's Hamilton College, if I remember right, that it's there, or Hampton College. It's been a long time since I was there, but they would challenge, and many of the faculty members and the students had mobilized the community against Knoll and the Oneida community and what they believed. Knowles tried to pass the leadership on to his son, who's named by him as well, Jr., John Humphrey Knowles Jr., but however, his son just had no interest in leading a religious organization. Eventually, after Knowles' death, the community quickly faded away. And I think it was by 1880, I think it was before he died, but in the 1880s, the Oneida community had to divest itself of money and stocks that they owned from the Oneida cutlery ware. So therefore, the community eventually faded away and dissipated by the turn of the century. But again, this is something quite different as a religious movement, that they had capitalized on that kind of Armenian style belief that they could perfect themselves in this life, here and now, but through quite different means. Again, so this is where religious expectations or the free market system kind of works in a way, because if you have a religious community that says, God wants you to have lots and lots of sex with lots and lots of different people, come join us. Well, of course, a lot of people are going to come join you for a while. And it offered something new and something different. And having this emotional experiences that you can experience God through sex. But eventually the community would subsequently died out because of social norms and social practices. And so those are kind of the two examples of these utopian groups, and they have different weird interpretations. And so later, some of these other religious movement groups that you have are those that are sometimes identified as new visions. And so we're going to talk about two specific groups within here. So while the utopian community sought to reproduce kind of earthly heaven ideas on earthly existence here. The other side of the coin of these new religious movements, they came into existence because the perfectionist motifs were a little more subdued. Instead of trying to physically create heaven here on earth, that they would lighten it a little bit. So they had these different approaches. So they're kind of referred to as restoration movements, that their goal is not so much to create heaven on earth, but is to recreate the early church or the early church community instead. And so, and why they were important is because, or why they emerged was because of a prevalent feature among these groups that they were either, their founder was either given some kind of supplementary or new revelation about God or a hidden vision that is out there. So you had this kind of new revelation or supplement revelation that was tied to millennial expectation of God coming back any day now, as well as a great emphasis upon spirituality as well. So the first and most prominent of these new religious movements, or sometimes known as the Restoration Movement, is in fact the Mormon Church, or Mormonism, or sometimes known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So the Mormon Church is significant. It's one of the largest of the new religious movements here in America. As of 2018, the Mormon Church is in fact the fourth largest Christian denomination. So behind Catholicism, behind Protestantism, behind Jehovah's Witness, you have the Mormon Church here in America. So with around 6.5 million Americans identify themselves as Mormons, and I think around 11 million worldwide identified themselves as Mormons, and they're one of the fastest growing Christian denominations in the world, but they only represent about 2% of American population. So a lot of times people think Mormons are taking over the world. We had that with the Mitt Romney presidency, that a lot of people, created all these false rumors and false stories about Mormons taking over. It's just not true. Mormons population is very insignificant here in America, but they are, again, the fourth largest Christian denomination in America. So they are significant, but they're not as scary as the media had made them out to be during the Mitt Romney presidential campaign. So Mormonism has its roots with the teaching and the life story of Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith was raised in and had experienced much of the Second Great Awakening. So you can see much of his life is during the Second Great Awakening. And he was greatly disturbed at all of the religious controversy and the divisions that he saw and that had swirled around American Christianity. And he blamed the revivalist movement. He blamed it specifically because it was trying to create a religious experience at all costs to local societies, that it wasn't always the greatest thing. So the story goes that while Smith was praying one day, that he received a divine revelation. And the story goes that he was received an encounterment from an angel named Moroni, who subsequently told of Joseph Smith about the true lost history of the Christian church. And that instead of the Christian church existing through the lives of the early apostles and existing through the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church to this day, but rather that there's a forgotten story that the early church had lost and had not foretold. But Moroni had come to end this and use Joseph Smith as this medium in order to tell the story correctly. Then instead, that the church was preserved through the disciples and through the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. Instead, prior to Jesus dying, or I mean, not dying, but going back to heaven, that Jesus instead went to America during the first century, went to America and had evangelized to a group of Indians there, the Nephilites, who were in fact, according to the angel Moroni and Joseph Smith, were in fact the lost tribes of Israel. That Israel actually had, the children of Israel had actually came to America at one point. And so that Jesus came, preached the gospel to the Native Americans, and initially the Native Americans believed. They were Christians. But at some indistinct point in time, the neophytes were attacked by a rival group of Indians who refused to believe in Jesus and believed in Christianity, but in turn believed in this new form of religion that became Native American paganism. Or not paganism, but Native American beliefs. And so in turn, uh, the rival Native Americans subsequently killed all of the neophytes, those who believed in Christianity or in this form of Christianity. And so the last two that were left was the angel Moroni and his father Mormon. And Mormon, in turn, decided before he died to write a history of the people, of his people in America, and then subsequently buried that book within a mountain or a hill in western New York. And so Moroni had returned in order to reveal to Joseph Smith his father's lost book, the Book of Mormon. And so Joseph Smith discovered this book out in the mountain, out on this hill in western New York. And so the book was written in this kind of Egyptian hieroglyphic like language, written on a series of tablets made of gold, and that the angel Moroni assisted Joseph Smith in translating the book. And so Joseph Smith just merely translated the book into English, and that book subsequently became known as the Book of Mormon. So eventually, the Book of Mormon was completed. It was first published in 1830, and Smith declared himself to be a prophet of God, and that his form of church was the one true church of Christianity, and that the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches were all false churches, and that his form of religion was the one true religion of Jesus Christ. And he also declared that his church should give heed to all my words and commandments. For my words shall you receive as if from the mouth of Christ. So within the Mormon church, Joseph Smith kind of receives uh, this kind of authoritative figure, similar to that in Islam with the Prophet Muhammad. And so it's interesting very early on, if you read the records of the Mormon Church in America, many of the Americans, when criticizing the Mormon Church, would often call them Mohammedans, a phrase that was often referred to Muslims. And so the early American Christians, when they came across and heard about Mormons, they thought of them as a new form of Muslims because they identified Joseph Smith so much with the Prophet Muhammad. But on the side note is that. So anyhow, while Mormonism did reflect very typical Protestant beliefs, it's very similar. If you ever go to a Mormon church, I encourage you to go to a Mormon church. It's extremely similar to any Protestant church that you go to, whether Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal. It's very similar, but there are a few distinctive doctrines that were later added. So Mormons typically are anti-Trinitarian. They do not believe in the Holy Spirit. They do not believe in this triune God. They do believe in Jesus, but Jesus is the Son of God, but God is still greater than Jesus. And so they're not co-equals as Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox Christians believe, but rather God is much higher in their circle. So they believe in God as God the Father and Jesus as being subservient to God. and not co-equals to God. They also believe in a plurality of gods. They believe that God, Jehovah, was one of many gods and that he created this earth for himself. And so that when Mormons, when they die, they believe that through piety and through their practice of the Mormon faith, that they in turn could become gods as well, and thus subsequently rule over little universes within themselves. And they also, very early on, believed in polygamy, and the polygamy being the marriage of multiple wives by a man. And and so thus, because of these beliefs in being anti-Trinitarian, plurality of gods, and being polygamous, Mormonism's, even though that they are very Protestant in much of their beliefs, there's still clear distinctions between them and the rest of Christianity. And so that's why Mormonism gets seen as a subgroup within Christianity, just like Catholicism or Protestantism is. And so typically Mormons don't like to see themselves as Protestant Christians. They are something different. So, due to continued eternal communal pressures, the Mormon community eventually was forced to flee New York, to leave for Ohio, subsequently after Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon for safety, but then later had to flee to Missouri in 1835 because of more persecution, and then ultimately to Illinois because of more persecution in 1839, and Navajo in uh, Illinois. They established a community there for a long period of time. While in Illinois, the Mormon Church became, because of persecution, the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith organized his community into be a resistance force. That they actually had an army known as the Navajo Legion, or the Mormon Legion, that they had trained soldiers, and Joseph Smith trained a militia group in order to protect like-minded Mormon communities. There was a campaign, even within Joseph Smith's lifetime, for him to run for president of the United States because of the persecution that they sought. He thought if he could run as president and become president, that he would subsequently be able to lead the American community to accept the true doctrine, that is, of Mormonism. However, because of his teachings and because of his actions in Illinois, eventually in 1844, Smith was arrested for inciting riots in Carthage, Illinois. And then later, while he was in jail, on June 27th, a mob stormed the jail in order to try to kill Joseph Smith. The story goes that Joseph Smith, was kind of prepared, that one of his followers had snuck a gun into the prison, or really a house. He was placed in house arrest. And so a mob came to kill him, and Joseph Smith actually fought off some of them. That he shot a man, I think he shot two people. One of his best friends, who's also in prison, was shot and killed. And in an attempt to sneak out the window, Joseph Smith fell out of the window, and story goes that he fell out of the window and fell on his neck and thus broke his neck. But then there's other stories that he was in an attempt to fall out the window, but there was an armed group of people that shot him to death, and then he subsequently fell out of the window. So we don't know, but he was assassinated, and so thus Joseph Smith becomes a martyr for the Mormon Church, and thus as a prophet solidifies himself within the Mormon Church tradition. Eventually, the community, a crisis, a succession crisis, soon emerged, and then subsequently a schism was formed within the Mormon Church, with some who didn't trust who the eventual leaders would be, and so the Mormon Church kind of schismed for a while. But eventually, the leadership passed, instead of to Joseph Smith's sons, passed to one of Joseph Smith's close companions that of Brigham Young. And it was under Brigham Young's leadership that he successfully led the community to Utah in 1847 in hopes of creating a what he called a Zion in the wilderness. And so that's why the Mormon Church has a significant population in Utah, and why the Mormon Church has a university named after Brigham Young. And a little side note, the San Francisco quarterback Steve Young is one of Brigham Young's great grandsons. So, Steve Young is related to Brigham Young, and he went to school at BYU there. But that's, real briefly a history of the Mormon Church, but you can see this new vision that he had, and thus created a societal group after him. So another prominent religious movement to kind of continue among these early ones, for many elements of the Protestant faith, there's this emotional complexity that was tied to apocalyptic expectations. And so there was this fear of God's judgment that was constant. And any time that there was suffering in America, um, this kind of national crisis that was going on, it was always equivalent to God's justice on the America. That America had become the new Israel, the promised society that was promised in the New Testament, and thus becomes associated with American prophecy. And so we have new religious movements that emerge out of this. And so a primary example of this is the Adventist movement within the Restoration movement. And so I just want to isolate one group among them that emerged but eventually fade away over time, but would then lead to the Adventist movement being created, were the Millerites. So the Millerites attribute their leadership to a man who really didn't want to be a religious leader, and the man William Miller. So William Miller was just a simple farmer from western New York, just south of Buffalo, who in his spare time was an avid study and student of the Bible, and particularly eschatology. So eschatology is just a famous $2 word that means, from the Greek, eschaton, last things, ology, study of, so study of last things. And so he was read the book of Revelation so many times, read all of the Old Testament prophets, and was just fascinated with end time prophecies. However, the story goes in 1828, Miller believed that, in fact, he had accidentally discovered a biblical code within the Bible, in which, if it was read correctly, he was able to calculate the exact time in which Christ would return to earth. And so, according to his own stories and some of his friends, he felt called to tell the world of his discovery, that Christ would come back to save everyone and take everybody in rapture in the year 1843. So this was in 1828. So the story goes that Miller was quite, reserved, didn't want to tell anybody of this because he's just a simple farmer. But eventually, in 1831, he went public with his profession, and then later published a book in 1836 in order to warn people about the upcoming pandemic, that Christ was coming back, that people needed to get saved before Christ comes back, and the world is going to end. However, in 1836, no one ever bought Miller's book. No one ever heard about Miller. But thankfully, to Miller's aid came in U.S. history the famous Panic of 1837, in which the American economy crashed because of the failure of the banking system, and the economy went to the doldrums. And so everybody thought that this was a sign of the end time. And so everybody remembered some of Miller's books and started to buy his book, and Miller's popularity started to grow because many Americans felt like this was the sign of the end of times, because the economy had crashed, unemployment was high, if there was unemployment counting at this time, money was worthless. There was also disease that was going on at the same time. And so it was just a traumatic period. So, of course, during traumatic periods, apocalyptic expectations often run amok. So the story goes in about 1839, Miller was contacted by a salesman, Joshua Hims, who actually read uh, Miller's book and believed in his prophecy. But Hims was a salesman. He wanted to promote Miller and his revelation because he actually believed that this was true. And so Hims had a partnership with Miller in that he would organize tours, that he would organize and have published mailers that would go out from Cincinnati to Pennsylvania, or not Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, all the way down to Atlanta, Georgia, and the newspapers that people would buy up his mailers that would be sent out. And also creating various literature, forms of literature, books, cartoons, stories about warning of the incoming prophecy. And so, really, as I have here, both Miller and Hims became really America's first TV evangelists. Miller went on public speaking tours. You would buy his books, buy his materials, buy his artwork to help you understand the end times. And so subsequently, because of Him's effort, by very quickly within 18, I think it was within 1842, Hims had created a following of 50,000 people who subscribed to Miller's writings, who believed in Miller's prophecies, and who would come to some of his tours that he would host. And they believed that the world was going to end as soon as 1843 rolls around. So subsequently, of course, when 1843 rolls around, in January, Miller announced that he had a vision and that Christ would return on March 21st, 1843. So people had a full year to repent and believe in Jesus and forgive their sins. But however, when March 21st, 44 came about and Christ wasn't back, it didn't happen. People started to panic. Wait a minute, Miller. We believed you. We believed that this was coming back, that Christ was going to come back. However, so Miller went back to the drawing boards, and then he came back and announced, he said, wait a minute, I was wrong. It was actually May 2nd. So Miller announced that he had did some miscalculations of several dates, and that the new date was going to be October 22nd. Sorry, that on May 2nd he said he was going to do this announcement, and that the new date was going to be October 22nd. However, that didn't happen either, and so it's known as history as the Great Disappointment. And so newspaper articles like this, made fun of Miller and his followers and the Millerites, of Miller claiming this prophecy of this vision of God and his kingdom coming down and going to save everybody, and it didn't happen. And so the movement of the Millerites quickly dissolved. However, some people actually believed that this was going to happen. So eventually groups splintered and dissipated, and some of these new religious movements formed their own, and they would subsequently become known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They took some of Miller's ideas, didn't think Christ was coming back literally, but instead that Christ had come back, but yet they were to live themselves in a new way of lifestyle, an Adventist lifestyle that would be promulgated among Seventh-day Adventists. And later groups would emerge as the Jehovah's Witness. And so these are examples. I'm just giving you examples of these new religious movements. Between 1820 and 1850, there was over 20 new religious movements that emerged during this time. But they prominently fall within these categories of restoration movements or utopian style movements. And so here's some of the popular examples among them. So the last thing that I want to talk about is minority voices in American religion, and more specifically, the Native Americans. As America moved westward, their passion for land continued to strain relationships between America and the tribal nations. And thus, to make things worse, tribal nations, tribal lifestyle was significantly disintegrating in terms of society, tribal societies being able to sustain their traditional way of life, that they were being forced to become Americanized and Europeanized. And thus, a new religious dimension to their identity became fading away. And so, what we see among the Native Americans early on was that you see Americanization and Christianization, and how the natives took it as, instead of embracing this, they saw it as an assault on their own lifestyle. So, similarly, as the 19th century was represented early on as a Great Awakening movement for white evangelicals, the 19th century also represented a revival movement within Native American cultures. And so we'll talk about the first half here, then later we'll talk about the second half as it kind of transitions, but there are running themes. And so for the first group, we have a couple of prominent figures. We have, Native American prophets like Handsome Lake or Tenskwatawa, or the Cherokee prophet Tsali. We don't know his dates, but it's during the War of 1812 and subsequently after the War of 1812 that he emerged. But we just have few writings of him. But however, all three men kind of represented a pan-Indian resistance movement. They all had different interpretations, different presentations, but they all wanted a Indian resistance movement to the encroachment of white European American lifestyles upon native cultures. And they all were fostered by religious experiences. But they all had different approaches. But all of them basically had this basic vision among them, whether it's Handsome Lake a couple of years earlier, or Tenskwatawa. Basically, that this vision that they all had, similar visions, that they blamed the fate of the Indian people that was going on is because that they had accepted social practices introduced by the English and the Americans, particularly the use of alcohol. And so here is just an example of Tenskwatawa's message and his sermons of what he would typically preach. If this would load here real quickly.
When Lalawathaka recovers from his vision, he says that he has come with a message. And the message is, I think, a message of revitalization, of restoration, for a people who've lost their way in the way that he had lost his way. He is a reformed individual. He takes a new name for himself, Tenskwatawa, the open door. And the message that he brings, that Indian people can make themselves whole again by rejecting the worst influences that white people have brought to them, hits a powerful chord. It gives people who may have lost hope a new hope. It gives them a direction. It gives them an opportunity to remake themselves, to restore themselves by reviving their Indian culture and identity.
Well, the impact is he reforms instantly. He suddenly doesn't drink anymore. And he is preaching to others now that if you want to save yourselves, you have to have a personal revolution in your way of life.
My children, the Great Spirit bids me to say to you thus: you must not dress like the whites. You must not get drunk. It displeases the Great Spirit.
And he formulated a message that appealed to a great many Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, because that was their experience at the time. You know, this is a world totally out of balance. And so his vision is the vision for all Native people in a broad way. It's intended for everyone. And as a recovered alcoholic, he could speak to people who had not had that conversion experience, who were still caught up in that cycle of despair.
He took the name Tenskwatawa, the open door, which was a way of, he was suggesting that he was a way that you could reach grace through him. He was a doorway to salvation.
Friends and family members were astonished by the changes that had transformed Lalawetheka almost overnight, and none more so than Tecumseh himself, who all through the fall and winter of 1805 looked on thoughtfully as young men from across the Midwest trooped into their village along the White River in increasing number, drawn by his brother's siren call of renewal, and by his brother himself, who would soon be known simply as the Prophet.
Yeah. So that's just a brief example of Tenskwatawa's message. And so you can see that it was this, they saw their society and they saw the social ills that were going on within Indian culture was because they were abandoning much of their old traditions and adopting English and French practices. And so if they would go back to the original way of life, if they go back to the old rituals, there would be a return. But subsequently, because of more and more Western or European invasion into Indian territories, we also get where they started advocating if they would return not only to old practices but old rituals, that the Native Americans could anticipate a specific apocalyptic event that would not only destroy their enemies, the Euro-Americans, but it would also restore them to a former abundance in the wildlife. In the wild. And so people like Tenskwatawa and then later his brother Tecumseh would go on to lead Indian rebellions against the Americans because they saw that if they would fight, if they would embrace the old ritual ways, the old Indian ways, that the spirits and the gods would be on their side, and that they could destroy their enemies and return back to the way the world was prior to European invasion. But however, Handsome Lake was a little bit different. Handsome Lake instead was exceptional in that he decided the way to combat Westernism, to combat European practices, was to make basically to make Indian religions and Indian cultures more morally acceptable. And so instead, he wrote a famous book in which he codified a system of moral codes and ethics that would show that Native American practices, particularly Ocoya practices, were far superior than Christianity. And so upon closer look, it seemed to be a combination of German pietist movements within the Christian Quaker belief system as well as Ocoya practices. And so he tried to shame Americans in their practices and showing that the native system of life actually preserved and produced a more ethical and pietist way of life than the Christians did. And with their own revival systems. But however, Handsome Lake's efforts were able to restore Ocoya Indian practices. Both Handsome Lake and Tecumseh's actions prove to null and void as the American hostilities continue. So due to increased hostilities and desire for more land, the U.S. started to adopt a policy of relocation and tribal reservation for Native Americans, basically to kick them out and remove them instead of to allow Native Americans to occupy certain territories within the western borders or the eastern borders of the United States. Because of Native Americans wanting to return to their ancient practices and their ancient communities and thus abandoning and rejecting Americanization and American Christianization, Thus, the United States policy became a one of seeing Native Americans as enemies and thus having to be squashed out or physically relocated. So the most famous example is being that during the Jacksonian presidency of the 1838 famous Trail of Tears, in which Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw Indians were relocated in mass numbers from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi territories out to Oklahoma, and thousands upon thousands of Indians died on the way due to elements and starvation as well. But eventually, because of Native Americans' continuous emphasis and practices and trying to revitalize Native American practices as a way of resistance to American cultures, the United States offered a policy of restricting and limiting tribal religious practices because many Americans interpreted it as resistance, which it was. And so, for the most part, really from 1821 was when some of the first early anti Indian religious laws were passed, all the way up until 1978. It was illegal for Native Americans to practice their religion outside of the reservations in the United States. But thankfully, during the Carter administration, Native Americans were granted the right to practice their religious beliefs anywhere in the U.S. and in the United States. So thus we see something different. And so we'll kind of revisit this a little bit later. Once we move further and further out west again, we'll pick up the same conversation of Native Americans resisting Americanization and Christianization by reverting back to their old rituals and old native cultures as a form of resistance. So thus using religion as a form of resistance.